and keep people, and we'll try to keep people on mute as much as possible, just to cut down on any background noise. Um, as you, as I already mentioned, this will be recorded, so it will be available later. Um, as we go through, if you have questions, you can put them in the chat, but we should also have a couple of minutes at the end, to address any live questions that you might have. And so the first half of this is going to be me just kind of going through the background of the NFIP and permitting in general, regulatory standards and those kinds of things. And then in the second part, we'll have Jordan Hoffmeyer with the Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks present on the endangered species aspect of permitting because it can often be overlooked. And it's not something that comes up all the time, and he would definitely know more about it than me. So I'm really happy to have him here to go over that content. And so this is a presentation that was adapted for a conference, and so it hasn't really been presented on before, but it was made for a shorter presentation, so that's why it's only the first half of the hour. And so in my part, we'll just look at the common misconceptions and answers about the NFIP, and then go through into the permitting. And so we'll start with a little bit of background and floodplain mapping. So in regards to mapping and our floodplain program at the state, we have a relationship with FEMA. And so our partnership with them, they're on the federal side, we're on the state side, and then through that relationship, we then work with communities that participate in the program and with the public. So we are FEMA Region 7, which includes Kansas and three other states, that is Nebraska, Iowa, and Missouri. And so on our side with Annabelle and I, we are on the CAP grant, that is the Community Assistance Program grant through FEMA that allows us to have this relationship and support communities in their participation. And so we provide training like this, education, and then assistance with NFIP regulations through what we call general technical assistance. Basically, communities will reach out to us with questions about mostly regulations and permitting, but also the community rating system program. So that's an incentive program on top of the NFIP. Um, Potential violations, their mitigation grants, and other grant opportunities. So basically anything to assist with floodplain development and support in that way. And so we kind of have the three legs of the KDA-DWR floodplain management program stool. And so this is based on what FEMA considers the NFIP milking stool, meaning that we have floodplain management supported through a three-legged stool. So the CAP grant, um, it's again the Community Assistance Program, so that helps us in support of the regulation side of what FEMA considers part of that stool. So having strong floodplain management regulations that apply to those high-risk areas so that we make sure that development is done in a resilient way and in a performance standard that is appropriate to the level of risk. We have FEMA Region 7, again, our federal partners who support us and provide these grants to us, and also provide the NFIP insurance opportunities. So any citizen that is in a participating NFIP community can get flood insurance if they wish, or if they have a federally backed mortgage in those high-risk areas, then they are required to purchase a policy. So participation in this program makes those policies available. And then mapping. So the floodplain mapping program we have established so that we can identify where these high-risk areas exist, close to streams and other flooding sources, and that is supported through our CTP grant. So that is the Cooperating Technical Partner Grant, and that is the other side of our floodplain team that works with engineering firms and our contractors to develop the mapping work. And then through us, we work with communities and the contractors to go through these mapping details and make sure that they're appropriate for that community and that the community believes in the accuracy of those maps and what you might see during the 100-year event and even beyond that, some advisory or future conditions types of mapping situations. So that grant is also funded through FEMA, and so we work across the state um, to get these maps produced. It does take a long time. There's, many meetings that go along with that, which we attend and support our mapping team with for any regulatory questions on our side. But so this is how we support the NFIP three-legged stool. And then some people do insists that the fourth leg is mitigation. So there are other mitigation grants for these floodplain high-risk areas through the Hazard Mitigation Assistance Program grants. So there are pre and post-disaster grants that are available as well, although those are handled through our state Department of Emergency Management, so that's KDEM, and not us directly, but we do work with them in conjunction with that to support mitigation as well. So moving on, of course, we do have many instances of flooding in Kansas throughout history. We have supported programs in the past to provide historical signage and yeah, things of that nature to let people know of past high water marks and events that have impacted their communities. We've supported turnaround, don't drown signage through the National Weather Service. And so we try to communicate this that yes, there are past incidences of flooding that warrant having flood maps and regulations, and it varies very much as possible for communities to experience these events, even if it hasn't happened in that resident's lifetime there, or just their residency there and their experiences, or even their anecdotal stories of no flooding. We just try to provide that information that yes, flooding is possible and it has happened. So we try to keep that in the minds of people, especially as we experience things like drought and other pressing um, possible disasters, tornadoes, not always associated with floods, but oftentimes they are, or even fires that have happened. It's hard for people to associate those things with flooding sometimes, so we try to keep this in the back of people's minds. And so, if there is a flood of any type, it doesn't have to be the 100-year flood, but we will reach out to communities to offer assistance and check on how they're doing and how they're handling things, what the scope of their disaster might be. Of course, even in the last couple of months and even the last couple of weeks, we've had some flooding going on, mostly here in eastern Kansas. We just had some pretty intense weather. And so any records that you have, of course, please let us know if you experience flooding of any degree, but we do appreciate these types of pictures and videos that we can share and store in our files so that we can compare different disasters. And this will also help with our mapping team having this kind of evidence of, where water is accumulating and things like that. So we do try as much as we can to keep track of recent flooding and reach out to communities to provide assistance. And so there's, communities just experience different types of flooding. It could just be streets and isolated to those areas. Lots of agricultural areas are where water will accumulate. We have ponding. Of course, inundation of structures is our most pressing concern as far as our team and how we assist with the assessments that have to be done and going forward with good regulations and making sure that the floodplain management part is being done. But there's overbank flooding from the stream, which is our most common uh, threat that we have is overbank riverine flooding, especially in eastern Kansas. But yeah. And so between 2019 and 2024, and I can and I will update these as we go, forward through the years. but we've had 8,171,000 paid out in total for 340 insurance claims through the NFIP. And then in 2025, 2,592,000 paid for 84 insurance claims through the NFIP in the state of Kansas. And so um, as we move forward, weather patterns are just looking a little bit more unstable and unpredictable. And so, we want to make sure that we're at least building back in an appropriate and resilient way to further combat any unexpected changes or variations or even outliers in patterns as we go on. And so we do strive as much as possible to improve mapping, getting those new techniques and technologies and updating maps as much as we can and in areas that have outdated or even no maps, and then encourage communities to adopt regulations that are above the minimum standard to help protect new development or repair of existing structures. So you can find this map on floodsmart.gov, and you can find historical NFIP claims and information and trends through that website. That's also where you can find flood insurance providers. So basically, flood insurance is provided through your typical insurance companies. They are just able to write the policies through their companies under the NFIP. There's a possibility of private flood insurance policies, but I do have a slide that might get into that a little bit more later. Um, so there is a lot of kind of lockdown on specific information as far as individual insurance claims. FEMA is pretty strict on uh, the Privacy Act and personally identifiable information. So FEMA does have kind of a new process for communities to access that information. And I can get that to you. We're just in a period where FEMA is kind of transitioning and they're starting to get active again in some of these areas after the shutdown ended. And so some of these things are a little bit in the air as to how they will change and end up. But I can get aggregate information for you, like as far as how much policy is in force and how many policies in your community. Um, and so we can work on that. And I think you can find other forms of aggregate data for your county as well. So you can always reach out if you need information on that kind of thing. Um, and so we look at disaster assistance versus having actual flood insurance. And a lot of people just don't believe a flood can happen to them, but where it rains, it can flood. And so, especially for these high-risk areas that we map and that we are regulating, insurance is far better than trying to rely on disaster assistance, which is extremely limited and maybe have to be paid back. And so, as far as eligibility, you have to be in a participating community in the NFIP for you to access the NFIP flood insurance policy. Disaster assistance, you would be reliant on a presidential disaster declaration. And while those can be requested and the thresholds met for that, it's still very much up to discretion for those to be issued. And so it may take a long time or that declaration may never come. And as far as usage of funds, insurance is comprehensive coverage for recovery, repair, and rebuilding. And so those amounts are, set when the policy goes in force. Whereas disaster assistance, it's basically a kickstart to help you start the recovery process, but there's really not a whole lot of recourse if your entire property is lost. Following a payout, of course, insurance, there's no payback requirements, whereas disaster assistance, it's typically a loan that accrues interest that has to be paid back. Um, so quite different there. Could be a heavy financial burden. Availability, insurance is continuous, renewed coverage for NFIP policies, whereas disaster assistance declarations aren't awarded for all floods. And so it's very um, tentative on what will be approved and which counties and things like that. So um, it's not reliable to think that you will get disaster assistance even if you participate in the NFIP, which is why we try to promote insurance so much. So there are impacts, and basically these are sanctions by the federal government that go on communities that don't participate in the NFIP for those high hazard areas. So if you don't participate in the NFIP, no one in that community can access NFIP flood insurance. And if that's the case, then anyone buying a structure in those areas, you're required to send them a notice that they are in a special flood hazard area, and there's a potential for increased actuarial rates if they ever are required to buy insurance if that community joins the program. Um, and then there's no access to federally backed loans. So I mentioned earlier there is a purchase requirement if you're in a high-risk area and you have a federally backed loan that you have to have a policy. If you do that in a community that doesn't participate, then you don't have access to those. And so a lender's not going to allow you to purchase that home. There could be the availability of private policies, but that is very hit and miss. We don't have a whole lot of information that's guaranteed on that. And it's possible that once you make a claim, it will become very expensive or you won't be able to renew that policy. So it's a little bit convoluted. And again, that's not going to be available everywhere in the same way that it is for NFIP participating communities. And then restricted access to disaster assistance, as we mentioned on that last slide. So, as of 2024, there hasn't been a whole lot of change to this map, very little. So it looks basically the same. Um, so this is what participation looks like across the state. So you have most of the eastern part of this or eastern half of the state really participating. And of course, the flooding concerns are more of a priority and more prevalent in the eastern side, whereas the western side, many of those uh, communities were separate from counties at that time. So many communities and counties in the western half don't have maps. It's something that we're working towards. As you can see, we kind of are working out west as we can. Some of these projects have moved forward since the creation of this map, which I apologize is a little bit outdated. But I do have another map that focuses on mapping our, but as far as participation, we do reach out to all of those communities that don't participate annually and as targeted outreach when they do get new maps. So we are consistently encouraging those communities to join the program. And then as far as in January 2025, again, some of these projects have moved forward. We don't always update these maps in a timely fashion, but anyways, this is for the most part up to date. We do have some of those counties in green that have moved forward in different stages, and we have some communities that now that are finally getting effective maps. So the progress has been moving despite a few hangups with our grants that support this work. So hopefully we're going to see continued funding now that we're seeing a little bit of movement and change on the FEMA side of things, which again support our work with the communities to update these maps. So if you go to our site, you can see um, all of these maps as well as the individual mapping projects. So we go by watershed, and then those get broke down into these individual county maps that you see here. So if you are more interested in this, we can certainly point you that way to see where our projects are at. And so the lifetime of a floodplain map. So again, maps are developed based on a community's flood risk. So the data and model flood risk is reviewed by the community, KDA and FEMA. And so I mentioned we have several milestone meetings throughout that process with the community to get feedback and to get public feedback as well. And then once we have finalized that, the community adopts that map and you update your regulations for development and naming those maps in your ordinance as to what you're regulating to. And then the community is responsible for enforcing those regulations within the floodplain. And then as that becomes out of date, we continue the process and um, a new project may start, or we're accumulating data in the very least, that as it becomes available, updated LiDAR, better topography, as those things start to come into focus, we start negotiating new projects with FEMA through our grants. So these maps started out as paper maps towards the beginning, and then eventually became digital maps. And at this point, we are on 2D digital mapping. And then there are other non-regulatory data sets that have been going forward, but again, it's a little bit unclear on what the direction is, but things are moving forward. So the significance of base flood elevations, or BFE, this is what we regulate to the expected height of the water at the 100-year flood level event. And so on the top, you can see the pre-firm. So basically, this house was built before the current map or before any mapping, and so flood risk considerations were not taken. So it's below what the current base flood elevation is, something we can expect. FEMA's minimum standards is at or above the base flood elevation. So the second house there, in Kansas, we have to have it 1 foot above the base flood elevation. So that's the last one with the higher standard that we have that is statewide. So that's what's required for new construction. And then letters of map change. Basically, if your structure is built at or above the current base flood elevation, depending on the situation, there are nuances here, but it could qualify for a letter of map amendment or change, whether it was based on fill or natural grade. If it's elevated high enough, you can get a letter from FEMA stating that it's out of the floodplain. So that is an option. And so, again, there are nuances as to what data do you use to determine a BFE. We are always here, but we have put together a bit of a flowchart here for proposed floodplain developments. So if it's in a zone A, yes, you can consult the BFE portal if you'd like us to calculate that. If it's in a zone E, or zone AE, then we would use the flood profiles from the flood insurance study. So that comes with the flood insurance rate map. And so then you would use that, the data tables. If it's a lacustrine or lake/reservoir flooding source, then there's the still water tables. And if it's a shallow flooding zone, AH or AO, that is a depth number that you would use. And for those zones, we've been pretty much phasing them out of new mapping. They're a little bit outdated, but this is just kind of an overview of how data is used to determine how high the lowest floor needs to be elevated. So the letters of map change, most commonly LOMA, built on natural grade so that the lowest adjacent grade that's touching the structure is naturally at or above the current base flood elevation. So FEMA will look at the effective data only. Either that, or if you're removing a section of property or an entire property, the LLE, which is the lowest lot elevation, is at or above the BFE. There's no fees for this type of letter. It's either the MTEZ for one property or MT1 for other situations. Those application forms, typically this will require the survey and it's submitted through FEMA's online portal by the surveyor or an engineer. A LOMAR F, or a letter of map revision based on fill, is almost the same as a LOMA, but they have brought in earthen fill to elevate that structure at or above the base flood elevation, although the lowest floor still has to be 1 foot above for these types of letters. So there's the community acknowledgement form that has the floodplain administrator sign off that this proposed development will be compliant. Again, at or above the BFE, there is a processing and review fee for these requests because you're changing the map. And this is through the MT1 form. And then again, it's the same online portal that would be used. So we do have more training on all of those topics individually. If you go to our training page, we do have those individual classes. But since this is just an overview, we will go through just a little bit more on regulations, permitting, and development. And so we don't have to look and read through all of this. It's just our base regulations are on the 44 CFR 60.3, basically A through E, and then there are some other parts that pertain to the program, but this is what outlines the NFIP minimum standards, and then our state permitting regulations are a little bit higher than that. So we do have state regulations for fill or obstruction and changes to streams, and so that goes through our stream obstructions team in Manhattan. And then we have state model regulations, so we provide communities template ordinances that they can fill in that meet our federal and state regulations. And then they can go even higher with their regulations, and we have options for that as well, on a voluntary basis to better protect their communities. And so a permit is required for all development in the special flood hazard area through the community. So that means structures, new buildings, manufactured homes, subdivisions, basically anything walled, roofed, and principally above ground. And then other non-structural, filling, grading, excavation, removing structures, or um, anything that's not walled and roof will still need a permit. So development is any man-made change to improved or unimproved real estate. Variances are a possibility. We discourage them, but basically, if there's good enough cause, if there's hardship to using the land itself, then as long as it's not increasing risk to public safety, expense, or fraud on the public, the community has discretion to issue a variance. And then basically, the hardship relates to the land itself, nothing to do with the property owner. Um, and attempts to keep deviation from zoning minimal, and we're not increasing any risk to the public. Um, and so the permits, as you can probably discern, has all these elements of the NFIP. There could be these additional documents needed. Again, we have other training, but floodproofing certificates, no rise for floodway development, as we'll see later today, Endangered Species Act, which will become important, and these other elements. And so I think we'll wrap up here with post-flood substantial improvement and damage. Basically, after a flood, um, we will respond again by reaching out to the community. However, we find out about it through the media, through the media or KDWP. We'll try to coordinate responses with you. We offer assistance with assessments, and we try to support you with technical assistance to you and the public after the event. And then we'll probably do an end of year audit just to see how you handled your recovery. But basically, if there's substantial damage through any type of event, a fire, a tornado, or a flood, whatever happens, we do have to do an assessment on that structure to determine if it's substantially damaged. So we have to include costs of material and labor, debris disposal, any interior finishes, exterior finishes, built-in appliances, and structural elements. But we do exclude a lot of things like cleanup or outside improvements, things that are not tied to the actual structure. And then mitigation, we do, again, have those grants available for the most part. So that's mitigation actions can be achieved through floodproofing as a structure, relocating it, elevating it, or just demolishing it and keeping that as open space. So as I mentioned, auditing, we have the concise audit, which is community assistance contact. We just do a very brief overview of your floodplain program. And then the community assistance visit is the actual in-depth audit where we look at the last 3 to 5 years of development and we meet with the community. We look at development over the last couple of years in the floodplain, and then we help you with any needed retroactive permitting, which again could probably happen through a disaster event. And so um, development in the special flood hazard area that does not meet the minimum requirements of your adopted ordinance is a violation and it makes structures more vulnerable to flood damages or any other damages, higher insurance rates, and it could lead to potentially FEMA imposed sanctions on the community. So that will wrap up my portion, and I will stop sharing my screen and we can move into Jordan's portion of the presentation.
Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
All right, let me work on getting my slideshow up here. Okay, are my slides showing up?
Yes, it looks good.
Okay, thank you. Thanks everybody for tuning in this morning. I'm Jordan Hoffmeyer with Kansas Wildlife and Parks. I'm the Assistant Director of our Ecological Services Division, and specifically I oversee our Threatened and Endangered Species Regulatory Program for the state. Um, So, quick overview, what we're going to cover. We'll do a quick review of the meat and potatoes of our threatened and endangered species regulations at the state level. I'll give you all a little peek at our relatively new online ecological review tool. And we'll wrap up looking at some different ways that you can verify compliance with these regulations in your own permitting processes. So the Kansas Nongame and Endangered Species Conservation Act was passed in 1975, and it offers some protections for state-listed species, and it establishes the responsibility of conservation of these species. But what does this conservation actually look like? So we'll start out with some definitions. We have three different listing levels at the state. Species in need of conservation are protected from take, which means that they cannot be killed, harmed, or harassed. Threatened and endangered species have a higher protection level. So they're also protected from take, but they're also afforded habitat protections as well. And so, because of that, those are what we're going to focus on for this presentation. And so, where do those protections come into play? Um, So, state statutes and regulations allow us to review any project that is a publicly funded action, receives state or federal assistance, any actions requiring a permit from another state or federal entity, and most commonly for us, those are permits from the Department of Ag, Department of Health and Environment, and the Army Corps of Engineers. And this also includes actions that are likely to impact designated critical habitat or state listed species. Um, so, through these different nexuses, we review between 2,000 and 2,500 projects a year, roughly 20 to 30 of which we permit to address critical habitat impacts. And where the rubber meets the road for us is when a project may impact designated critical habitat, and that's a regulatory definition as areas that are currently providing physical and biological features that are essential for the species or areas that are essential to the conservation of those species. So let's, and when we review a project for potential impacts, um, location of the project, aspects of the project's design, and how it is built are all considered when we're trying to determine if there are habitat impacts. So we'll take a quick look at where those habitats are across the state. Um, I'll give everybody just a second to orient themselves, but um, I should note that not every single highlighted yellow area on this map represents critical habitat. You'll notice that there are some entire counties that are highlighted. Not every square inch of that highlighted county represents habitat. This is just a visual representation of where this habitat could occur. Um, so in those areas that are highlighted, things like projects that are developed in cropland or existing gray space, for example, those would not represent critical habitat for these listed species and therefore would not require a permit for development. I should also note that this map does periodically change as we monitor how these species are doing. Sometimes species are removed from our list if they've recovered or we find that they're doing better than they previously were. Or conversely, if one species is truly becoming in jeopardy, we may add some areas to the map. So just know that this map does change over time and is not static. So when a project might potentially impact critical habitat for listed species, um, we would potentially look at issuing an action permit. And so action permits are a legal document between us and a project sponsor. Those permits detail some general and special conditions that avoid, minimize, or mitigate impacts to critical habitat and, in general, protect natural resources throughout the construction of the project. Some of those permit conditions can look different depending on what species is being considered. So for some fish species, there might be in-stream workdate restrictions during their spawning periods. If there are imperiled mussels within a certain river, those may have to be moved out of the construction area. Um, there's potential for requiring local habitat improvements nearby the project, and that could be scattering of logs, creation of brush piles, or reseeding native plants. Or more rarely, a project may be required to offset habitat impacts elsewhere by creation of new habitat, enhancement of existing habitat, or preservation of high quality habitat. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about our new ecological review tool. This launched in 2024. We're not going to spend a ton of time on it because we do have help tutorial videos on that page. Um, so basically, somebody that's proposing a project can go into this tool and enter information about the project, draw it on a map, and then submit that to us. And within just a few minutes, this tool will provide them a report of whether their project was cleared or whether we need to take a closer look at it. And we'll get into what those reports look like a little bit later. So, a couple of things up front. First and foremost, the ecological review tool is a regulatory tool. So anything submitted enters our regulatory process and will receive a regulatory response. So this really should not be used for sub things should not be submitted that are in early planning or scoping phases. But we do have some planning, excuse me, functionality with some of the different maps that are available. And given the audience we have here, I would not recommend if you're trying to check compliance on a project for threatened or endangered species, I would not recommend that you submit those projects to the tool. Um, but some of you might have other responsibilities within your community to secure permitting. Um, and so that might be an instance where you would be submitting a project. So I'm going to attempt to bounce out of this and onto our tool real quick. Okay, are you all seeing the website now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Um, so this is the homepage for our tool. And again, I'm not going to give a full tutorial on it. We do have video tutorials available on the help page, but if somebody were to want to submit a project, you'd go to create a project. And for your purposes, you can search by a lot of different things. You can search by a business name, you can search by an address, a city, county, GPS. Um, so we'll just look at my office here. It wouldn't come up, of course. We'll try address. Okay, and so you can change the map types or the base map types. So I like to do imagery with labels. So here you can see our office um, and the hatchery over on the west side of the road. So if somebody were submitting a project, say we're going to, create a new warehouse, we would draw it in down here. And then you enter in some information about the project and submit it, but we're not going to go all the way through that. A couple of layers of use for this tool and specific for what we're looking at. So, as I talked about, there's designated critical habitat spread across the state, and we actually have some uh, in the South Fork Nenasko River here north of us. So if I were to draw a project within this area, it would flag. And I'll get a little bit more into what that means a little bit later. Right now, where I've drawn this project to the south, that project would receive a clearance report. Um, Other useful layers for us. So there's public lands and conservation areas. So this is actually a designated wildlife area here north of our office. Um, but we'll jump into reports here, bounce back over to spreadsheet or the PowerPoint. Okay, so as I said, there are two different types of reports that can be generated from this tool depending on where the project is located, and we'll get into some of that. But so this example is a project that was cleared, so it did not occur in critical habitat. You can see from the report, the automated determination indicates that project clearance is granted, and our ecological review findings state that there is no permit required by KDWP. So in this case, this person has completed their consultation with us and there's no further action on our part. I will say that our reports are good for 1 year from submission. And that is because, like I mentioned before, our species listings do change over time, and that kind of stuff. So that can affect the validity of these reports. So let's take a look at um, a project that did not receive clearance. So this is what we'd call a conflict report. The automated determination indicates that further review is needed by our department. The ecological review findings say the same thing, further review by KDWP required. And a different part of this report that does not show up in a clearance report is conflict details. And that talks about why the project was flagged for further review. And in this case, the project occurred in critical habitat. So what happens at this point is this project has been flagged and we will complete a manual review of the project. And I should also mention that critical habitat is not the only reason that a project might flag. If a project is proposed um, that intersects with one of our wildlife areas, that would be flagged. And also certain project types that are known to have significant wildlife impacts are automatically flagged for a closer look. So, as I said, we will manually review these and get back to the submitter within 30 days. Um, but in this case, this report indicates that consultation with us is not yet satisfied. So, as I said, we'll take a look at these manually, and the two outcomes that are likely to result is we will follow up with the project submitter directly and clear the project if there are no concerns. Um, so we'll provide that through an email or a letter. Or if there are potential concerns for habitat impacts, we will issue an action permit. So we'll kind of wrap this all up and what can you do in your role to verify compliance with our state Endangered Species and Conservation Act? My recommendation, and I think the cleanest and clearest way would be to ask the applicants to provide an ecological review from our department. Um, and that, could look like three different things. It could be one of those reports that I showed you from our ecological review tool. It could be that, um, say, the project was initially flagged by the ecological review tool, but we followed up with direct clearance. They could provide that as well. Or if they provided a signed action permit. I'll reiterate that our reviews are good for 1 year. But if you have any questions about any of this stuff, please feel free to reach out to us. We are happy to help determine compliance with our state act. I will say if that's probably best if you've gotten a report or some kind of correspondence from us provided by the applicant. If you need some help interpreting that, we're happy to do that. If they've not provided anything um, to you directly, it may require an open records request from us to obtain those reports if they've submitted anything. So here are some other informational resources for you. Our website has information about our ecological reviews and action permits, um, and information on threatened and endangered species. Also, as I mentioned, our ecological review tool can be helpful. It would probably be helpful for some of you. This may never be a concern if there is no critical habitat within your county or municipality. Um, So it wouldn't hurt to familiarize yourself where that habitat occurs, and you can do that through our ecological review tool. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention our federal counterparts. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is who manages federally endangered species, and they have a field office in Manhattan. Um, Here's some contact information for them. But they also have an online tool called IPAC. I am less familiar with that tool, but um, I'm sure they would be happy to provide guidance on that. And I do know that Annabelle and Cheyenne offer that as one of the resources when they're recommending ways to check compliance. And with that, I am happy to take any questions.
Great. Thanks, Jordan. So I don't see any questions that were put in the chat, but does anyone want to come off mute to ask anything? And while we do that, Annabelle, if you want to launch the poll for the certificate. So this is just us collecting information if you'd like the certificate for the 1 hour of continuing education credit. Okay, well, not hearing anything, of course, you have our contact information. I think I will go ahead and combine these slides and then send them out in the follow-up if that's okay. And then, of course, reach out anytime anyone has questions on these topics.